Israel is being pounded with ballistic missiles from Iran. It's running out of its own missiles to knock down those Iranian ballistic missiles. And it's begging the United States to send air defenses to the Middle East to help pull the Israelis' chestnuts out of the fire. You call this winning? In my world, it's called losing.
So recently, John Mearsheimer went on Judge Napolitano's podcast to talk about why he thinks that Israel is losing its war in Iran, why this was a disastrous choice to launch this war, and why the U.S. shouldn't be involved. So let's watch and let's react. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
Is Israel prevailing in its war against Iran, as the mainstream media is telling everybody in the West?
No, Israel's in serious trouble. I listened to President Trump not too long ago say that Israel is winning. And of course, this is the mantra in the mainstream media. But the question you have to ask yourself is, what does winning mean? It's a meaningless comment by itself. And the way you assess whether a country is winning a war is you ask yourself the question, what are the goals and what is the strategy that that state has for achieving those goals? And Israel has three stated goals here. One is to eliminate the nuclear capability of Iran, their ability to produce nuclear weapons. And this is all about enrichment. The second goal is regime change. And the third goal, which is articulated by President Trump himself, is unconditional surrender. Of course, if you get unconditional surrender, that takes care of the first two goals. But these are the three goals. Then the question you have to ask yourself is, what is Israel's theory of victory? Tell us how they're going to do this. Well, with regard to the first goal, which is eliminating Iran's nuclear capability, it's clear they can't do that by themselves. They admit that. And that's why they're begging the United States to come in. And Trump is pondering whether to help them. But I would submit that even if Trump comes in, we're not going to eliminate Iran's ability to develop nuclear weapons. Then there's the business of regime change. We do not have a single recorded example in history of a state causing regime change with an air campaign. Remember, we had to invade Iraq to get regime change. We couldn't do it from the air, and we would have to invade Iran to get regime change. And nobody in their right mind is talking about invading Iran. And in terms of unconditional surrender, this is a laughable argument. Right? We've put the Iranians in a position where we are threatening their very survival as a state. They're going to fight to the last person. They're not going to submit to unconditional surrender.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Mearsheimer's analysis is always sobering, it's always rational, and he's totally right. There's no reason to believe that Israel is triumphing so far in this war. There's no regime change. There's no dismantlement of the nuclear power program. In fact, they're not even striking nuclear power sites, which rams home the fact that this is for regime change, first and foremost, above the other objectives. And there's certainly no unconditional surrender, even though that's what Trump is tweeting or posting on his Truth Social. So yeah, Israel is not having a good experience here, and they rely so strongly upon the U.S. Their victory seems tied to drawing the U.S. into this war and striking offensively on its own. And Mearsheimer's right. They expect a regime change, but no one wants to invade. It doesn't seem like that's a legitimate prospect unless boots on the ground go in. It doesn't seem like that is on the table right now. I hope that I'm wrong and that doesn't happen tomorrow, because who knows right now based upon what's happening. So Mearsheimer's right.
So what you see here is that the Israelis have no way of achieving the goals they've set out for themselves. And even if we come in, that's not going to solve the problem. And in the meantime, Israel is being pounded with ballistic missiles from Iran. It's running out of its own missiles to knock down those Iranian ballistic missiles. And it's begging the United States to send air defenses to the Middle East to help pull the Israelis' chestnuts out of the fire. You call this winning? In my world, it's called losing.
Yeah, hard to disagree with them there. They rely so much on U.S. involvement in this war to enact any of those or realize any of those goals, to be sure. We haven't seen that yet. and it's still uncertain to the extent that the U.S. is going to participate in its own independent strikes upon Iran. It might come. Man, I'm praying that it doesn't. This is the last thing we need, and it totally, even if you're a fan of Trump, this jeopardizes the rest of his agenda. I've talked about that on other videos, but there's no way he's going to get his protective tariffs and the immigration reforms and attacking regulations if he splits the MAGA base over this. And it is split. Steve Bannon and Charlie Kirk and many others do not agree with this course of action. They've been, very vocal about that on social media, and this has a true ripple effect through that coalition. This coalition does not have uniform beliefs on war. And if you're going to take one side of that, it's going to alienate part of that coalition that comes from the more dissident side, the more non-interventionist side. And there is many of those people that supported Trump. Many libertarians did, actually. So I think that's what we're going to see.
So Israel's theory of victory must be Netanyahu begs and the donor class demands that Donald Trump get involved and we start dropping 30,000-pound bombs.
It doesn't solve the problem.
Right.
And the media is full of stories these days showing to you that, dropping 30,000-pound bombs on Fordow is just not going to solve the problem. You probably cannot destroy the centrifuges down in the bottom of that mountain that are producing the enriched uranium. You just can't do it, even with American bombs. But let's assume I'm wrong, and you can destroy those centrifuges. Almost everybody agrees when you look at how extensive, how comprehensive the Iranian nuclear program is, that they can easily rebuild that program in a year or two, and we'll be back to where we started. So there's just no way that even with the United States coming into the fight, that we can eliminate Iran's nuclear capability.
That's right, and so far they haven't even targeted it. Indeed, like I said before, or implied, they've only struck residential areas in Tehran. They've put out evacuation orders for Tehran, where there's no nuclear facilities whatsoever. And to be clear, Iran has a nuclear power program. They don't have a nuclear weapons program, according to DNI Tulsi Gabbard's threat assessment delivered back in March, which corroborates what MI6 and Mossad think about this. So even Mossad doesn't believe they have a nuclear weapon. They're warning that they're so close, but Tulsi Gabbard said there's no evidence they've even reconstituted that program. I've repeated that over and over, but the warmongers are still using that as the propaganda to sell this campaign and U.S. involvement therein. But Mearsheimer is right. Just bombing Tehran or trying to bomb the nuclear power facilities isn't going to accomplish regime change. And Benjamin Netanyahu has been explicit that he wants regime change.
Professor Mearsheimer, President Trump has insisted that Israel owns Iran's sky.
Of course.
Is there any accuracy to that? That Israel has destroyed Iran's air defenses and Israel now controls Iran's sky?
I don't think so. It's very hard to figure out exactly what's happening here, in large part because the mainstream media coverage is so terrible.
Yeah.
But it appears that what has happened here is the Israelis have not penetrated into Iran and destroyed Iran's air defense systems, their ground-based air defenses. You remember when the Israelis first attacked, this was on June 13th, and for about the first 2 days, everybody was puzzled by the fact that the Iranian air defenses were just not in the fight. This was really quite amazing. So the question is, what's happening here? My sense is that what the Israelis are doing is they're using drones, and they're firing missiles from places like Iraq into Iran. And they're doing all the damage that they're doing. And I don't want to make light of the damage that's being done to Iran with cruise missiles and ballistic missiles and other kinds of missiles that are fired from outside of Iran's border or barely inside Iran's border. But I think the argument that the Israeli Air Force completely controls the skies over all of Iran is not true. You would have needed a big battle, a big air battle against Iranian air defenses for this to be the case. The Iranians had significant amounts of assets on the ground that had to be dealt with, and there's no evidence that that fight took place. So I don't think they control the skies over Iran. That's the Israeli Air Force. But I do think they have the capability to lob missiles into Iran and lob bombs into Iran and put drones in Iran that can do lots of damage.
Yeah, I haven't studied this area of the conflict very thoroughly, but that sounds right to me. Owning the entire sky of a rival power seems odd if you consider that there hasn't been as many strikes as there were initially, it seems like, so far. But maybe we'll learn more about that, so I'll defer to Mearsheimer on that.
Did Israel destroy or damage Iran's oil refineries?
There has been some of that for sure, and the Iranians have done the same to the Israelis. So far, the Israelis have limited the amount of damage they've done to Iran's ability to produce oil. I think if the Israelis really unleashed the dogs and they destroyed Iran's oil infrastructure, that would, in all likelihood, lead to Iran shutting the Persian Gulf and getting the Houthis to shut the Red Sea. And that would have, I think, disastrous consequences on the international economy. So the Israelis have not gone that far yet. But, the question you want to ask yourself here is, if I'm correct that the Israelis are in trouble, and I do believe I'm correct, what are they going to do to get out of this problem?
Call Donald Trump.
But again, Donald Trump is not going to solve the problem for them. Right.
What is the level and depth of the trouble that they're in? What is Israeli society, politics, economy, culture like today?
Well, the thing you want to remember is that the Israelis depend very heavily on the idea or the notion that they have military superiority over everybody in the region, that they are invincible. And if they start a war and they lose that war, they don't win that war, and indeed it looks like Iran wins the war, this is a significant defeat for Israeli deterrence.
Yeah, totally agree with that. Plus, they're so dependent on the U.S. to both bankroll them, provide them with intelligence and weaponry, and all the resources they need for these fights. Their slaughter in Gaza, the invasion of Lebanon, their claims in Syria, all the madness that, is involved in the idea of greater Israel is tied at the hip to the United States. So they're really banking on the fact that the U.S. is just going to catch their back all the time. And so far, essentially it has on almost every situation imaginable, especially in the more recent past. But if that ever stops, it's going to mean serious consequences for Israel. I don't expect that to stop. But Mearsheimer is right. If they end up failing ultimately in this war against Iran, the U.S. doesn't end up bombing Iran for some reason, none of U.S. troops get touched in any way that are in the region, and this effort turns out to be futile on their part, what makes other powers in the region, think that Israel is just an undefeatable juggernaut? I'm with him on this completely.
It's just something that's almost unthinkable. They started this war thinking that they were going to win a relatively easy victory, and they were going to do to Iran what has been done to Syria. But that's not going to happen. The Iranians are going to stay in this fight. You want to remember that Iran fought against Iraq for 8 years, from 1980 to 1988.
Well, in those days, we were on Iraq's side, right?
That's correct. That's correct.
Well, technically, the U.S. was on both sides at different parts of that, but in the initial invasion and the few years after that, the U.S. did support Iraq. So Iraq was essentially the proxy of the United States. If you think about what Ukraine is or Israel is today to the United States, that's what Iraq was in 1980. And it caused a lot of turmoil and tension between the two countries. It's why, it certainly contributed to Islamic Jihad bombing the Marines in Beirut, and Reagan thankfully just getting them out of there. That was the best decision for that time. It inspired the creation of Hezbollah when Israel then invaded Lebanon, and animosity has been stirring with Iran ever since then. Actually, before that, in the 79 revolution, the hostage crisis unfolded. So there's been so many tensions, and the U.S. has funded some of these places that turn out to just be disastrous for the U.S.
So the Iranians, I think, will stay in the fight. And I don't think Israel can maintain this fight over the long term.
Does their enormous international airport, the Ben Gurion Airport, is it operative?
No, I think it's shut down at this point in time. I don't think that any airline would fly in there, even if the airport were open, for fear that a ballistic missile would come in and destroy the aircraft. This is one of the principal problems that the Israelis face. This is taking a huge toll on their economy. People can't go to work. The airport's closed. And you want to remember that the Iranians are targeting Haifa, which is an important Israeli port. And ships are not going to be willing to go into that port for fear they'll be blown up by a ballistic missile coming in from Iran.
Do any serious players besides Trump and Netanyahu and these people at Palantir actually believe that Iran has nuclear weapons?
I don't think any of them believe that Iran has nuclear weapons. I think the question is whether you believe Iran is pursuing nuclear weapons. In other words, it's on its way to getting nuclear weapons. As you know, Netanyahu's been arguing for 30 plus years that that Iran is on its way to getting nuclear weapons, and it's only a matter of a month or a year, depending on when he's making the argument.
Yeah, he's been making that argument since I was a child, beginning in at least 1992. There's lots of graphics going around with substantiation that he made those claims over and over and over to drum up this war and this regime change, which seems to be perhaps culminating right now. So he's right. Not even Trump or Netanyahu himself is willing to go out there and say Iran has nuclear weapons. None of them have even claimed that. Some of them are claiming, well, that's the impetus for the war. They're close to getting one. Trump's been saying that repeatedly in various interviews, once on, I believe, Air Force One, and once today at an airfield, said that essentially, that he's close to getting one. But that kind of contradicted the testimony of Tulsi Gabbard back in March. And that's where we're at right now. So I'm with Mearsheimer here. Whether or not they're pursuing one is different than whether they have one. And not even the biggest warmongers are claiming that they have one right now.
Before Iran will have a nuclear arsenal. That's never proven to be the case. And there's no evidence now that Iran is pursuing nuclear weapons. But there's no question, as I've said before on the show, that Iran has a significant nuclear enrichment capability, and that takes them close to the point where they will have enough fissile material for a bomb. But even then, it would take them a good year to build a bomb and then create a delivery system for that bomb. So they're a good distance away from a bomb, and there's no evidence that they are getting a bomb. But you can't tell President Trump that or the Israelis.
Yeah, absolutely correct. And what I don't understand about this whole thing is, why does it always have to be perceived, even by Americans, through the eyes of Israelis? Well, they could use their nuclear bomb on Israelis, which doesn't exist. Well, actually, I'm an American. If you're actually America first, they don't even have close to the level of delivery mechanism that would be needed to hurl a nuclear weapon at the United States, despite all the crazy propaganda of a mushroom cloud appearing over New York. This is not our fight. It doesn't concern us. And if you're going to talk about Israel, let them deal with this independently. Withdraw all aid. That's, perhaps a utopian thought on my part, but that's the America First solution. If Israel wants to deal with Iran, it's not really, I want it not really to be my problem. Of course it is, because taxpayer money is seized from me through extortion by the government to fund this madness. I want no part of it. And guess what? We inherit Iran as even more of an enemy than it already was because of this relationship.
Don't Israeli military planners understand the basic rubric or even truism that you talked about earlier, that you can't win a war from the air alone?
I would have thought so. I was actually quite surprised that the Israelis attacked on the 13th. I didn't think they would do it. I think they're basically jumping off a cliff here. And I would imagine that at the lower levels in the planning process inside Israel, a good number of people understand that. The counter to that is that they did understand it, and what they were counting on was that the Americans would come in and pull their chestnuts out of the fire. But I would imagine that even a good number of Israeli planners understood that there were limits to what the Americans could do. And furthermore, you can't be sure that the Americans will come in. I mean, if you look at what President Trump is doing now, it does look like he's beginning to back off. That
You don't.
Interesting. That's not my impression at all. I believe, as he said, that this was an Israeli gambit, maybe not an especially risky one, to believe that the U.S. would catch Israel's back and participate, even if they made this look like this was their unilateral action. But it doesn't seem to me that Trump is backing off. His vitriol has mostly remained the same. They're moving naval resources into that region, and it looks like strikes might happen soon. Now, if that changes, I will eat crow, but it looks like at least the posturing is such is that the U.S. is going to play a greater role in this. I guess we'll have to see. What I dread the most, the prospect I dread the most, and I know I keep saying this in my videos, is if U.S. soldiers in that region get hit, because that's going to guarantee U.S. entry. And this is about the best time in the world for a false flag attack to happen. Not best time, I should say, but the riskiest time for that to happen. Because Lord knows Israel wants the U.S. in this fight directly. It wants the U.S. to have fire in its blood and out for vengeance.
No, with him, and I think he loves to create that impression. His deceptions in Saudi Arabia, his pretense of negotiations prior to the attack on June 13th, as reprehensible as they were, may be part of this plan. Who knows if this 2-week thing is for real, or if, like our friend Cy Hirsch maintains, he's already decided to send the 30,000-pound bombs and they're on their way.
Well, they're not on their way. And he's never said that he has decided to send the bombs, which I think changed over the past 2 days as he's toned down his rhetoric quite significantly. And at the same time, if you look at the newspapers, the mainstream media newspapers over the past 2 days, more and more newspapers are talking about the problems that we would face if we go after Fordow, or more generally, if we get into the war. And furthermore, more and more newspapers are talking about the fact that Israel is in deep trouble. My comments about Israel's losing the war at this point would not have resonated with many people last week. But today is a different story. I think if you look at the mainstream media, people are beginning to sense that the Israelis are in trouble.
Yeah, that's partially my read. I do agree with Mearsheimer that the rhetoric from Trump that came out of his Truth Social when he was tweeting, unconditional surrender and like Iran's supreme leader is safe for now, that has toned down. But the actual decision making does not seem to have been toned down. Resources are being directed into that region. I haven't read the Seymour Hersh article. I want to read that actually to, get a deeper look at that. But Cy Hirsch is one of the best legitimate journalists of my entire lifetime. So, I'll grant him some credence just on that fact, and I'll read that article. But I'm partially with Mearsheimer. I don't know about the decision-making aligns with what he's saying, though.
Just about an hour ago, the Wall Street Journal posted a piece that the Israelis are running out of whatever supplies their Golden Dome, whatever missiles their so-called Golden Dome uses, and they're scrambling to get that stuff replaced by the United States.
Yes.
The Street Journal has been a mouthpiece. A lot of these people are my friends, but the Wall Street Journal has been a mouthpiece for the Israelis and the Zionists. For them to acknowledge it, they must have evidence of it.
Well, some people say that the Wall Street Journal is two newspapers in one. One is the stories that are news stories in the first part of the newspaper, and then there's the editorial page and the op-ed page. Right. And there's no question that the editorial page and the op-ed page is basically the propaganda arm, the most important propaganda arm of the Israeli government in the United States. But many of the news stories that they run about the war are actually quite good. And you're now beginning to see articles appearing in the news section of the Wall Street Journal that say in so many words that the Israelis are in deep trouble.
Yeah, I guess that's for the people that still read printed newspapers and the Wall Street Journal. To me, it seems like the biggest propaganda outlet of the Zionist lobby and the Israel lobby in the United States is our elected officials that are out there trotting the case for this war or increased intervention in it at the very least.
Perhaps Bibi Netanyahu wants regime change in Tehran in order to stave off regime change in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, wherever the capital of Israel is today.
Well, there's no question that if he does not succeed, if I'm basically right, that he is going to be in deep political trouble. He has started a war that involves huge costs for Israel. I mean, if you look at the damage that's being done to Tel Aviv, that's being done to Haifa, that's being done to the Israeli economy, the costs here are huge. And if he can't produce a victory, if he has to quit without victory, this is going to have devastating consequences for him personally. And as I said before, it's going to be a disaster for Israeli deterrence.
Is his government about to run out of cash?
No, I don't think the situation is that dire. And furthermore, as you well know, if it was that dire, we'd bail them out.
Yeah, our government would, not we. I would not be complicit with that whatsoever, as I've made clear, but our government would certainly bail them out. So I'm mostly with Mearsheimer here. I think he might be a little bit mistaken on, Trump's actions compared to the toning down of the rhetoric. Those are often, two forces that are not completely aligned. We have to realize that. But we'll see, I guess, how this plays out. It's a disaster for the U.S. to get sucked deeper into this thing. We're already sucked deep enough. If they're losing, what they need as far as resources for the Iron Dome, that is concerning. Iran has pushed through ballistic missiles in through the Iron Dome, making it a sieve to some extent, as Douglas McGregor has said recently. But just the political ramifications of this are rough. And Mearsheimer might be right. Finally, after all these years, Netanyahu might pay the price for funding Hamas, enacting this genocide in Gaza, and, creating this preemptive strike in Iran. He might eventually go down politically when he was, and if you ask me, I think he's one of the biggest criminals that's ever existed in my lifetime. He's a war criminal for sure. And he might finally face justice and corruption and fraud charges, even if you take off the Iran war and the genocide in Gaza off the table. But we will have to see. There's a lot that's going to play out, hopefully this weekend. I'm going to be praying for peace this weekend, that U.S. troops don't get touched. Innocents in Israel and Iran don't get touched, by the way. Yeah, I said innocents in Iran because they exist. They're the invisible man that no one in the corporate media talks about. Innocents on all sides don't deserve to die over this fraudulent war. And that's exactly what it is. It's based upon war propaganda, just like all these conflicts are. But I do want to hear from what you guys think. Let me know down below, is the U.S. going to get deeper involved in this war, or is it going to draw back a little bit? What is going to be the result for Israel, and what's coming next? So I want to hear from you on that. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and if you would, please consider becoming a YouTube member or Patreon patron. I would benefit from that greatly. It would support the channel. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. I'll catch you in the next one.